the most extraordinary existence, unlike any other in the history of civilization. We've had this carbon fueled, technology fueled, wealth fueled, growth fueled existence, and we're about to hit the brick wall. Now, often when I talk about climate change, people say to me, well, what would you know? You're a comedian. And that's reasonable, I suppose, up to a point. But when I was very young, when I was 8, in fact, the Olympic Games came to Melbourne, the first time in the Southern Hemisphere. And I think, was it the last time in the Southern Hemisphere? No, somebody's shaking their head. Where was the other one in the Southern Hemisphere? Come on, Liz, you know.
Sydney.
Oh, sorry. Oh, boy, fancy forgetting that. Really, I tuned out for that whole year. Anyway, it was certainly the first time they'd been held in the Southern Hemisphere. And it, like every Olympics, although not to the scale they are today, but we had to build new infrastructure. We got a new swimming pool, which shouldn't have stood up. It was an extraordinary piece of engineering. And almost daily in the newspapers, there were architects' sketches of what a building would look like. And I like drawing, and I like the drawings of the building, so I decided at around the age of 8 that I'd be an architect. And I went to an open day at the university, and I found out that you needed year 12 mathematics, and it wouldn't hurt to have physics and chemistry as well. Well, I didn't do the physics and chemistry. They left me behind when I was about 14, I think. But I kept the mathematics because I needed it as a prerequisite. I sat the maths exam in year 12 and I failed it. I had to repeat year 12, and I sat the maths exam again and I failed it again. So the third time I did it, my parents got me a tutor, and I did a couple of hours extra maths at home each week. And at the end of my third year of year 12, I failed the maths exam again. Anyway, the next year I really knuckled down and I passed the maths exam, but that year I failed English and I had to go back and repeat. Anyway, through all of that, I finally got into study architecture, and I was very lucky. And this is something I've only thought about in the last few years, a realization that almost everybody who taught me was in some way a product of the Second World War, whether they had served or whether they'd lost people, whether they'd had family return with limbless or brainless or whatever happened. That was my generation. And my maths teacher was a European refugee. She was the head of, what was she head of? Physicists Against Nuclear War. She was the international head of Physicists Against Nuclear War. My science teachers were all extraordinarily gifted people who were also part of a movement to stop nuclear war. I was called up for Vietnam in my first year at university, and I was very lucky to have a secretary of the department who later went on to become one of the proper left-wing Labor politicians in Canberra, a man named Peter Milton, and he negotiated my way out of the draft. And so I was very lucky to have those people there. I was unfortunate that mathematics, chemistry and physics were very quite central to be an architect. If you can't do those, your buildings fall down. And I couldn't do them. And so I did struggle. And in the end, I dropped out after third year. Took me 5 years to get to the end of third year, but they were very happy years indeed. So as I left university, I drifted into comedy. There wasn't a lot to drift into at the time, but I drifted into it. And as I got a little bit older, I started to think I was quite a clever guy. What did you say about me, George? That I was something clever anyway. But standing in the way of my belief in my cleverness was this complete inability to deal with maths, chemistry and physics. So for some curious reason, I can't remember, it was probably the very science show that George was talking about, because I used to listen to that a lot. I came across quantum physics, and I got really interested in it because there are not many things in the world that begin with the letter Q. QUANTOCK does, and quantum physics does, and Qantas Airlines do, but there wasn't a lot of comfort for people with a Q in their name. So I started to read about it, and very luckily through the 60s particularly, there began this, a number of people, mostly in the US, started writing very accessible books about quantum mechanics, not only about the science of it, but also about the history of it. And so I became quite obsessed with the history of science, and particularly the history of mathematics. I'm still no good at it, but I've learned through that to have an extraordinary respect for science. So when the science of climate change came up, and people like Andrew Bolt and the Heartland Institute and Nigella Lawson's father, of all people, started telling us that the scientists were wrong and they were only doing it for the money, there was no doubt in my mind that they were right. So I bumped into climate change about 15 years ago, and I applied my respect for science to reading the more accessible scientific papers, and really you read what's in magazines and newspapers and books. So I became quite an expert on climate change, and I probably still am. And even back then, I remember I was asked to give a talk at Melbourne University, and I'd been made an associate of the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, which is a cutting-edge institute based at Melbourne University. And so for a couple of years I was an associate. I don't know what it meant. I think I got one biscuit and a cup of coffee out of those 2 years, so it wasn't the best job in the world. But I gave a talk, and by the time I gave this talk, which would have been 10 or 11 years ago, I was completely and utterly convinced that it was too late to do anything about climate change. And so I put that to this group of students and academics, and I got some terrible kickback from people. It really quite shocked me that I was being what I thought was honest about it. And afterwards, people came up and told me I was an idiot and I was a fool and blah, blah, blah. And so for a while, I learned not to talk about that. And I've given hundreds and hundreds of talks about climate change over the last 15 years. I've done shows about it, always comedy. And I decided to do shows because in all the reading I did and the looking at things, in 2006, David Attenborough made 2 one-hour documentaries about climate change, which were never shown here. And they're very powerful. It opens up with him standing in the very place he stood in for his very first wildlife documentary, which I think was back in 1972. So it opens on the black and white footage of him standing with this backdrop of an African Rift Valley behind him. And then it dissolves through to him in 2006, sort of 40 years later. And the change in the background was really quite dramatic. And it was very powerful. The whole show was like that. And if you saw his Great Barrier Reef series, you could see how deeply he feels about what's happening to the natural world. And I thought, well, if he makes documentaries and nobody listens to him, I read the books, lots and lots of books. I've got a huge library of books about this. I read all those. None of those made a difference. And I thought, well, what the world's waiting for to really change its ways is a tall, bearded stand-up comedian in the far arse end of the world of Melbourne doing comedy shows about it. And it would only be a matter of time before people woke up and we solved all our problems. Well, clearly we didn't. And it wasn't for want of trying. But over the last few years, and I talk mostly to people like you, I mean, hands up anybody watching who doesn't believe in climate change. There you go. This is all bloody talk to you people. Nobody else listens. Um, but I do a lot of fundraising for environment groups, mostly around Victoria, but often in the state as well. I talk to a lot of local government functions, and local government is the only level of climate change action that is really tackling the problem seriously. And you would know that there are now councils around Australia that have declared climate emergencies. I don't know what that means in the end, but they've been declared. But what I noticed is that there are so many people, and they're people like you, and mostly they're older people. I do get younger ones, but they're generally dragged along by their grandparents. Um, and what I noticed that was there was this extraordinary number of people, um, wonderful people. I mean, over the years I've been involved in lots of campaigns around lots of issues, and I've met the best people in the world doing this. I wouldn't have met them if I'd lived the life of a high-profile television star. I wouldn't have met them if I'd done a lot of other things, but I've met some really extraordinary people. But what I've realised is that the energy and the wisdom and the knowledge that they bring to campaigning on climate change is misdirected. Um, there is a sense, and the analogy I always use is if I have the chance to say to somebody, look out the window, um, I'd say to them, well, that's what you want to preserve. Okay, you want to get back to a zero emissions, sustainable uh, way of living, but you want to keep the coffee shop and the scrambled eggs for breakfast on the footpath. You want all of those things. And that's what people imagine it will be. And it can't be that anymore. Now I'm going to do some graphs. I bought my trusty whiteboard, and I just wanted to, without, oh, this is horrible. I hate doing this. Anyway, it's got to be done. Somebody has to tell you. So I'm just going to do some graphs. I'll probably just do one a page. Is that? Yeah, that's good. You can see that. It's all back to front on my screen, so it's a bit difficult. So we'll just start with this graph here. Okay. And now which one was I going to do? Oh, which one will we do first? Oh, look, we'll do this because I'm very familiar with this. So we'll just do this one first. And this is the bell curve graph that I always do. It's a really important graph. This is the graph of just about everything finite. Let me use a bit of red. So this is, it covers everything. This is the average height of a population, of any given population. It's the number of cases of COVID from 0 to it being eliminated, we hope, in the future. It's COVID. It's peak oil. It's peak sand. We're running into peak sand. People in India now are killing other people to get sand out of rivers because of the building boom in concrete. China in the last 3 years made more concrete than the United States made in the whole of the 20th century. And concrete is one of the great carbon pollutants. Sand, and a particular sort of sand, you may remember they wanted sand mining on Fraser Island. That's the particular sort of sand that they want for concrete. So in India now there are pirates or gangs. There's a sand mafia. And places like Singapore are buying sand from elsewhere and dumping it in their harbours to expand their land. Now sand is a big issue. But anyway, this is this one. But this is also this is the graph of the end, because if we take this point down here and we call that well, we'll make it 12,000 BC. And I'm sorry if the writing's a bit strange, but we just mark that as the what we would call the beginning of civilization. Now, I've been thinking that the beginning of civilization was probably one of the great mistakes we made. And if we could go back and have a plebiscite, I think many people would vote against civilization, knowing what they know now. But civilization was always meant to be this thing that went up and up and up and up and up like that. But unfortunately, and this graph now is going to come like that. It's just going to go off an edge. So um, we oh, how do we look? It's Adam and Eve, really. It's the tree of knowledge. We're too smart for our own good. We began as hunter-gatherers. We did a bit of bartering. We learned how to make a bow and arrow and a drum and fire. But over time, we learned to make metals, which we turned, of course, into plowshares and swords. And once we got to particularly oil, the coal is obviously the changing point in industrialisation. Once we got those technologies and the power of what we thought was unlimited energy, then things just became haywire. And uh, by the time I was um, by the time I was 7 or 8, I'd been to the movies on a Saturday afternoon quite a lot, and I'd seen the old what was the old newsreel called that had the kookaburra at the start? Come on, you're old people, help me here.
Cine Sound?
Cine Sound newsreels. Yes, thank you. And it's very interactive, isn't it? Cine Sound newsreels. And on those, I'd seen the Australian soldiers marching back from the Burma railway, skeletons as they were. I'd seen the piles of bodies at Auschwitz. I'd seen the atomic bomb and the aftermath of that. I'd seen the destroyed cities of Europe and England. I had a very grim view of humanity, which most people did at the end of the Second World War, 2 world wars and the Great Depression, and people have very low expectations of humanity. So I think I've had in me over my life some sense that there could be an end and we would be responsible for it. I lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I can still remember sitting in a car out the front of my high school with one of my teachers and 4 other students, wondering whether the car would withstand a nuclear blast. We worked out it wouldn't, so we went and built a plywood fallout shelter in woodwork. We never had to use it. It's still available if you want it. So I had this very grim view, and I did an interview a couple of weeks ago with a fellow, and I was just remembering when I was 16, and again I remember this very well. It was 6 o'clock closing at the time. I was standing on a tram stop on Sydney Road in Melbourne outside a pub that was pouring all these drunk men out at 6 o'clock. And I was on my way into town to a very small cinema to see a film called The War Game by Peter Watkins. And The War Game was made in '65 for the anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki for the BBC, and they refused to show it because it was just so graphic and grueling. Anyway, the next year it won an Academy Award, and sometime later the BBC showed it. But it was an extraordinary documentary about the aftermath of a nuclear attack on Britain, and it was about ordinary people. It was just what happened to them. So I've just had in the back of my mind always that we're completely capable of destroying the world. And given the way it's heading, particularly you can see with somebody like Donald Trump coming along, it doesn't take a lot. So I got to the point with this graph, for instance, that which I always use in terms of peak oil. But this is, I've never used it this way before, and I don't know quite how it works. But for me, see, one of the things that is this a bit rambly for you? I haven't structured this very well. You stop if you're not following me. But one of the things that you get in a course like architecture, which is unique at a tertiary level, is not only do you get crushed by your inability to deal with the sciences, but you learn history, because our history in the main is marked by our architectural achievements. So there are remains in Iraq of the first towns and cities, and as you go through looking at these buildings, and most of the buildings that survive are major public buildings, whether they're civic or religious. So you learn about politics, you learn about religion, um, you learn about so much. And you can see in buildings how technology uh, took them from sort of mud brick lumps with a clear span of about 8 feet. And then you see with the Gothic cathedrals of the Middle Ages what extraordinary developments have taken place in people's technical knowledge of building. So I got all that history, and I got this sense of there being a trajectory that, you know, whilst there are little blips along the way, like the Hundred Years' War or the plague or whatever, that there was a trajectory of civilization going forward. But sadly, science has unraveled such extraordinary powers. Um, I would think most of the science done in the world today is done by the auspices of military through research and development. And most of those things we enjoy now, like our smartphones and so on, all came from a military background. And no doubt the Zoom meeting owes something to the US Navy or somebody. I've got no idea. So we've created those very powerful tools, which, as always, have got two ways to go. They can either go to the betterment of mankind, or they could go to the obliteration. So yeah. So in thinking about the pandemic, I initially talked mostly about climate change, but then I began to talk about things like peak oil and peak sand and peak soil. I think we're down now to 40% left of our natural soils around the globe. Soils take thousands of years to constitute themselves, and once you've lost them, they're gone for a very, very long time. So we're running out of oil. The other graph is this one, and this one, there's only three of them, so you won't get bored. So there's this graph here, and I don't know if that's got a name. It's an inverse exponential graph, I think is what it's called. So this is the graph of everything we're losing. This is the graph of habitable land. There's a report came out. If you don't do it, I recommend you get a podcast called Radio EcoShock. It's been going for well over 10 years. The guy who runs it speaks to the smartest people on the planet about these issues. And he spoke to, last Thursday, he spoke to a doctor from the Katherine area in Western Australia. And is Katherine in Western Australia or Northern Territory? You're not helping this time, are you? Anyway, and he's talking about heat stress. He said last year there were 54 days above 104 degrees Fahrenheit in the Katherine area, 54 days. And there gets a point with temperature, and it's combined with humidity, where it becomes impossible for people to live in those environments. So at 35 degrees C and 100% humidity, you die outside. Even if you're in the shade with a bottle of water, you will die because your body just can't cope with that degree of heat stress. And that's where Darwin's heading. Darwin's getting to the point now where they're going to have more and more of those days where it's impossible to go outside for any length of time. So Darwin, people will retreat from Darwin. They'll retreat from the Northern Territory as these temperatures become unbearable. So this graph is really about the fact that the population is going to collapse. There are varying estimates. Some people put it at 2100. I initially thought that it would be about 2050. I was aiming my catastrophes at 2050. But hang on, it's show and tell now. How's the time going, George? I'm not paying any attention.
It's you're 27 minutes in, nearly half an hour in.
Oh, okay. Well, we better get a move on then. Not that I know where I'm going. But oh, hang on, I better go to full screen for me so I can see what you can see better. It won't do that for me. I'm not important.
Just
Okay.
hover over the top and press full screen. Yeah.
Anyway, look, that'll do. So this is a book I wrote in 2008 called The Wonderful World of Climate Change. It was going to be a program for a comedy festival show of the same name. And unfortunately, it didn't get back from the printers until the show had finished. So I ended up with 10,000 of them. But where is it? So I had this one here. This is a mock-up of the, and I really don't know whether you'll see it terribly clearly, but it's a mock-up of the Melbourne Age of 2050. And I think it says civilization collapses, Prime Minister promises to rebuild. I have since changed that date to 2030. I changed it about two and a half years ago to 2030. And I think it is getting to that stage. The Northern Territory now is, inland Northern Territory is 3 degrees above pre-industrial levels on average. Darwin and around the coastal areas are getting up to 2 degrees above average. This time last year, the global average temperature was 2 degrees above average for one given day. So the idea that we'll reach the IPCC target of 1.5 degrees is a nonsense. That's really like me promising to win the 2008 Tour de France. It's a really good idea, but it's much, much too late. So we're on our way to 2 degrees, and from there we go to 3 degrees and 4 degrees. And that there was a big conference here in Melbourne a few years ago called just called the 4 Degrees Conference, and they were talking at around 2050 as well. Those people now are pulling that time closer and closer into today. So we're getting to a point where entire systems are breaking down. This is my, oh, it's weird sitting in, I'm in somebody else's house, in somebody else's bedroom, and this is really bizarre. But I just wanted to show you this. 96% is the sum total of all the human beings and all the animals dependent on human beings, domesticated animals. We are now 96% of all living things on the planet are either us or animals dependent on. That's what we've come to. We've lost insects in some places. 70% of insects have disappeared over the last 10, 15 years. Other places, 40%. Fish stocks are down. Everything's disappearing. We lost 20% of our forest over summer in those fires, which you've all now forgotten about. And Scott Morrison won't be held accountable for his Hawaiian shirt and his Hawaiian holiday because he's done so well in the pandemic. But that going to carbon neutral even now is not going to stop the next bushfires burning 30%. The only joy in all of this is that within 15, 20 years, we won't need a fire service because everything that can burn will have burned, and there'll be nothing left for them to worry about. So look, it's a grim picture, and I find it difficult sometimes to talk about. It's a bit different being sort of in the middle of all these faces looking at me. But so I wanted to commend to you a thing called transition streets. I'm sure most of you have probably heard of it. You certainly know transition towns. But the future will be local. It will be very, very, very local. And there are, for all of you, for wherever you're living at the moment, there are very, very, very good predictions of rainfall and temperature changes in your area. I think they're down to a grid of less than 100 kilometres now. So you can have a look at what the future holds for where you are, and you can start to think about, well, how do I live with that? How do I grow food with that? How do I share with my neighbours? How do I build a local community? And if you can find some way of maintaining solar or wind energy, then that's really obviously very important. But we're going to get to a point where there will be no industry, there'll be no globalisation, there'll be no bananas in Melbourne, and similarly you'll probably struggle to find an apple in Queensland. So all of those great networks that bring our food from around the world to our tables are going to break down, and the future really will be dependent on you and those people around you who can work together to produce something sustainable and dependable for you. So look, I'll leave it there. I'm happy to take questions.